Daryl read for us a couple of minutes ago a portion of the New Testament book known as First Thessalonians. You ever wonder why some of these biblical books have such bizarre names like First Thessalonians? Well, First Thessalonians is the first letter of the Apostle Paul to the Thessalonians, or to the Christian church in the ancient city of Thessalonica. That's why they were called Thessalonians, the people that lived in Thessalonica. And Thessalonica was a city in Macedonia. And for those of you who don't know your geography that well, and with apologies to any Macedonians who might be in the congregation today, that is northern Greece. And we heard the closing portion of the first letter to the Thessalonians, and in it we find Paul providing these kind of rapid-fire instructions. But before he could conclude the letter, he wanted to get every last little thing off of his chest that he needed to. And so he provided this list of instruction after instruction after instruction. It perhaps gives us insight as to why the Apostle Paul in his career started so many churches. It's because he was in the habit of just giving off instruction after instruction, and he probably wore out his welcome by being a bit of a nag. Out of all the instructions that we heard in the closing part of the letter, the one that jumps out most to me is this: in everything, give thanks. In all things, give thanks. That really jumps out to me for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, it's an incredible display of faithfulness, I think, to be able to say that in all different kinds of circumstances, we might be able to give thanks to God. So it's a great expression of personal trust in God to be able to give thanks. And yet, on the other hand, it's an incredibly challenging instruction, one which might seem virtually impossible to our ears. For we can well imagine all different kinds of times and circumstances where we would not want to give thanks, and in fact where we might find it virtually impossible to do so. Now, in a few minutes, we're going to spend a part of our worship time together saying thank you to Ruth for her ministry at Collier. And so that we might have the opportunity to put into practice this idea of thanksgiving and thankfulness, I'm going to spend just a few brief minutes with you reflecting on what it might mean to give thanks in everything. The first thing I think it means to give thanks in all things is to say that puts us in touch with the best part of ourselves. Now, when Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, give thanks in everything, we can hear by implication that there were things for which the Thessalonians did not want to give thanks, or felt they could not give thanks. If we read the entire letter of 1 Thessalonians, we find that one of the major concerns of the Christian congregation in that city was that some of the beloved members of their community had died. And they had inquired of Paul, can there be anything to lead us out of the despair we are feeling at the loss of these dear and beloved friends? Can we know or experience anything other than despair at the death of those whom we love? And Paul answered, give thanks in everything. It was a remarkable claim by Paul, For if we read through the catalog of Paul's letters in the New Testament, or read through the book of Acts, which tells some of his life story, we find that he experienced tremendous suffering in the course of his life. And not just suffering that was incidental to his life, but suffering which was brought to him in the course of his trying to follow the call of God upon his life. He suffered greatly for his God-given call. So how is it, or why is it, that he was able to say, "Give thanks in everything"? And he said that in part because giving thanks in all different kinds of circumstances, in things that are good and things that are bad, it puts us in touch with the best part of our created selves. Some of you may have heard the name Marva Dawn. Marva Dawn is a well-known American Christian writer. And for much of her adult life, she has suffered a series of incredibly debilitating chronic diseases. Now, I heard her speak in Hamilton in January of 2008. And she told those of us who had gathered how, of all the difficult years of her adult life, 2007 had probably been the most challenging. You see, she's had cancer for many years, and both the cancer and the treatment have led to all kinds of other serious health issues. In 2007 alone, she suffered from liver failure. She lost the sight completely in one of her eyes. Her blood pressure was so low that at times she could hardly move. Her cancer treatments were terrible for her bones, and her bones got very fragile. And over the course of that year, she suffered several broken bones due to the fragility of her body. And she told us how throughout the course of the year, she and her husband were just trying to survive one day at a time. It was for them as what Queen Elizabeth said in the 1990s, the annus horribilis, a horrible year. And at the new year, she and her husband were reflecting on all of the challenges they had faced in the course of the previous 12 months. And she said, "Do you know what? We have to make this coming year the year of gratitude." And she told us as soon as she had said that, she and her husband felt instantly better. Because they knew from that point on, they were going to focus not on what they couldn't have or couldn't do, but what they would have and what they would be able to do. It focused them on what they had indeed received from God and how God was loving and gracious to them in the midst of it all. So being thankful puts us in touch with the best part of our created selves. The second thing is that being thankful in all kinds of circumstances helps to reconcile us to the realities of a sometimes very harsh world. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, "Stay away from evil, and do not repay evil with evil." It was an acknowledgement on Paul's part and on behalf of the Thessalonians that there is evil in the world, that there is great suffering brought about by evil. in fact, the existence of evil and suffering and the whole question of how bad things can happen to good people, that's usually the main reason an atheist will give for, in fact, not even believing that there is a God at all. We live in a world that can be very harsh and difficult. Some of you may have heard the name John Claypool. John Claypool is another well-known American Christian writer. John had a daughter named Laura Lou. She was a beautiful, lovely, happy, healthy, full of life little girl. She was the absolute joy of his heart. When Laura Lou was 10, she was suddenly and unexpectedly diagnosed with leukemia. And within just a few short months, she was dead. As you can imagine, John was devastated. He didn't know how he could go on living. He didn't know if he could ever find a way out of despair. Well, in writing about that experience of overwhelming grief, he described how there were two suggested ways of trying to climb out of the valley that absolutely did not work, and only one that did. One of the things he said that did not work was simply to resign himself in faith to the mysteries of the universe and to the mysteries of God's plan. As so often when something like that happens, people will say to someone, to a parent or someone in grief, yours is not to question, but simply to trust in God's plan. Or sometimes people will say something like, well, now there's another angel in heaven. He said that kind of thing did not help him at all. The other kind of thing he said which didn't help was to approach his experience from a purely rational or scientific perspective. He could not look at the situation in terms of saying, well, there's a certain percentage of children who are going to be diagnosed with leukemia, and then another certain percentage that are going to die from it, and we just happen to fall in that percentage. Looking at it rationally offered him no comfort whatsoever. He said there was only one thing that helped him to find a way out of despair, and that was gratitude. You see, over time, he learned to see that his daughter's life was nothing but a gift. He didn't deserve her. He had done nothing to earn her. He would have wanted desperately to have had that gift for longer, but he couldn't. But that wasn't a reason he couldn't be thankful for the time that he did have her, for the time he did enjoy the gift of his precious Laura Lou. And he found that the only way he could even go on living was to be thankful. Being thankful can help reconcile us to the reality of a sometimes harsh world. I think the third thing about being thankful in all things is to say that it connects us with God, our Maker. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians and he said, "The one who calls you is faithful." It was a reassurance that no matter what their circumstances seem to be, and in our case, what our circumstances might be, God is with us. God is faithful to us. God will never leave us. Perhaps some of you have heard the story of Martin Rinkart. Martin Rinkart lived in Germany just about exactly 400 years ago, in the early 1600s, in the early 17th century. And he was a minister in the town of Eilenburg in Saxony, in the eastern part of Germany. And he was a minister in Eilenburg during the 30 Years' War. And Eilenburg was a walled city, and so people who were basically refugees from all over the countryside fled to take refuge in the walled town. Well, overcrowding became so great that the Black Plague set in. And to make matters worse, the Swedish army, against whom the locals were fighting, surrounded the outside of the city. They blockaded it so that no one could escape, nor could food or supplies be brought in. And so you can imagine how the circumstances in the town were horrific. Well, when Martin Rinkart first went to Eilenburg, there were 4 ministers. And 2 of them then died from the plague, and one of them was able somehow to escape, and he was left as the only member of the clergy in town when the Black Plague was at its worst. And for a stretch of several months on end, he was conducting some 40 or 50 funerals in a day. Now, I know Ruth has said that she finds doing funerals life-giving, and so do I. But I think 40 or 50 a day would be a bit much. Eventually, he had to conduct the funeral of his own wife. Well, sometime later, when the war began to wind down and people could leave and the plague began to subside, Martin Rinkart wrote this poem for his children who had lost their mother. And he wrote, "Now thank we all our God with heart and hands and voices, who from our mother's arms has blessed us on our way with countless gifts of love." How could someone who had seen such misery write such words of thanksgiving? It was because of an assurance of the abiding presence and care of our loving God, a God who is faithful to us, who in all circumstances remains with us, who in every case will keep the promises that have been made to us. And even for those who have known great misery in life, even for those who have lost loved ones or whose own health is failing, and indeed for all of us who might reflect on our own mortality, we can be certain that both now and forever we can be at rest in the arms of our loving and eternal God. Today is a bittersweet day in our congregation. We bid farewell to someone who has ministered lovingly in our midst for over 3 years. I don't do well with goodbyes myself. I don't know how you feel about goodbyes. I find it so hard to say goodbye. How can we be thankful when we have to do something difficult like say goodbye? Ruth has ministered here with such compassion. She has done so among many of our elderly and our shut-ins, and she has done so in the midst of a small group ministry, and in many other ways. And now we look to a time very soon when we will not have her presence. How can we be thankful? Well, in being thankful, it will put us in touch with the best part of our created selves. It will help us to focus not on what we won't have, but what we have had, and what a gift that has been. Being thankful will help us to be reconciled to the realities of a world that can be difficult. And it will help us to realize that even when things are tough, there is always much to be thankful for. Being thankful will help us stay connected with God. And it will remind us that Ruth's future is in God's hands. And our futures are in God's hands as well. Amen.